Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Wednesday to you. It's October 23rd. This is Let's Talk Tropics. And for the first time in a very long time, we don't have a disturbance nor a named storm or hurricane out there. So on the left-hand side, you can see all of the names that we have gone through so far during this hurricane season as we start to get into this last week of October and head into November. Now, November normally isn't a very busy month, but we have had some significant storms over the past several years, and even back, I think, in 2023. Last year, I think we had 3 named storms during the month of November. None of those were a big issue, but we can sometimes see some bigger storms. And even though over the next week or so, the National Hurricane Center is really backing off on any tropical development, some of the forecast models going into the early part of November are suggesting a bit more busy. So I think we're going to see at least 1, maybe 2 more named storms before the hurricane season is over as we get into November 30th. So the next name on the list will be Patty, then Raphael, then Sarah, Tony, Valerie, and William. And if we get down to William, that would be the 23rd storm. So we are above normal for the season so far, but we're still a little bit of ways from some of the early season predictions that were out there going for over 20 and at sometimes 23 named storms. So let's get to the particulars real quick. Another gorgeous day here in Acadiana. 79 degrees for your lunchtime temperature. Our dew point at 56, humidity 45% with a light breeze out of the northeast at 3 and the pressure holding steady at 30.19. And you can see those skies are crystal clear blue once again as we've got very dry conditions. A little more humid out there earlier this morning as those temperatures dropped into the upper 50s and the dew points were running in the mid to upper 50s. So when you get that temperature and your dew point meeting up like that, your humidity gets up to 100%. So we did have a little bit of patchy fog, and as we go into November, we start to get more into that foggy season during the early morning hours. I think for the next couple of mornings, we're probably going to see some fog out there, but you can see everything is cleared out nicely here this afternoon with mostly sunny skies. We will see a few clouds kind of popping up a little bit later on during the day, but unfortunately we're not seeing any rain in the forecast for at least another week. It's been almost exactly a month since our last measurable precipitation. That occurred back on September the 24th. So the only thing that we've really got to look at here across the nation's midsection is a bit of a frontal boundary right in here, and then that kind of extends back to another frontal boundary that's back off toward the west. So you got a low there and you got a low that's more in here. But as high pressure in the upper levels starts to kind of shift its way back off toward the west, we're going to see what's called more of a zonal flow where the air masses kind of run directly from west to east and very quickly across the country. And when you have that, you don't get any real significant storm systems to come by. So unfortunately, I'm not seeing any rain for the next week or so. Maybe middle part of next week, we'll probably see some chances for rain. If everybody go with the luck that we have here in South Louisiana, it'll probably come on Halloween. But let's hope that we could have some dry conditions for the kids doing some trick-or-treating and we can get some rain sometime soon to kind of satisfy everybody. And in the offshore waters, it's a fairly decent day out there. Light winds out of the east at 5 to 10 knots and seas running about 1 to 3 feet. And you can see the skies are really pretty out there. In the Gulf of Mexico, once again, you see a little bit of that fog that was dissipating over parts of Texas and southwest Louisiana this morning. That is now gone. In the upper levels, you've got the winds coming in from the west going to the east, and in the lower levels, you've got the winds going in from the east and going off toward the west. So kind of in opposite directions there over the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico. Central America is nice and quiet right now, but that Central American gyre is probably going to start to get more active coming up toward late next week and early in the following week. And if you're not familiar with the Central American gyre, it's kind of a big low pressure area that's kind of prevalent during the early part of the hurricane season and the end of the hurricane season. You get these counterclockwise rotations kind of coming around it like that. And occasionally you can get a disturbance. And Helene was one of those that was part of the Central American gyre. Milton was another one where the Central American gyre kind of had an effect on it, even though it was more part of an old low pressure system from a tropical system that was on the western side of Central America. But we do think it's going to get a little more active. It is active during June and the early part of July, and then it gets a little more active in October through the end of the hurricane season. And what's left of Oscar is now moving away from the Bahamas, so better days for our Caribbean friends down there to the southeast, and that is being absorbed by a low pressure, a non-tropical low pressure center. So it's still going to produce some decent winds as it goes by Bermuda, and it's also going to cause some coastal erosion and some rough seas along the New England coast and then over toward the Canadian Maritimes as well. But for the first time in a long time, the National Hurricane Center is showing no tropical cyclone activity expected over the next 7 days. So that's good news, and we usually will see more of this as we get toward the latter part of the hurricane season. So let's just go through the next several days here real quick and show you what's going on. I'm going to give you the latest GFS model here. And the GFS model is indicating a bit of a low pressure area trying to develop there across the western part of the Caribbean, and you actually get a bona fide tropical system. And I'm working on some of the extended forecast to kind of show you where the extent of that particular system would go, but it does appear that we're going to probably see a tropical type of system that will be developing in the western part of the Gulf, rather the Caribbean Sea, sometime next month, early part of next month. And you can see that kind of there at the very, very end of the loop. And it's a fairly significant system. And if you've been with us with Let's Talk Tropics over the last couple of weeks, this has been kind of the area that we're watching. And as I said, it could be generated from the Central American gyre, although it looks like the development on the GFS here is a little bit closer to the Colombian coast. So it might be part of that big, broad, low pressure area there. But unlike what Oscar was more of a tropical wave that kind of came in from the east and moved off toward the west. So the GFS model definitely is talking about something developing here going into the early part of November and then starting to slide northward. So our Caribbean islands there, Cuba, Jamaica, and even over toward Haiti and the Dominican Republic would need to be watching for this one over the next couple of days. So kind of stay up with that weather forecast. Meanwhile, the Euro model is showing more of a gathering of moisture over the western part of the Caribbean Sea, but it doesn't really show a closed low pressure area, maybe a bit of a low trying to develop there, but it just doesn't look quite as significant as what the GFS is trying to put down there over the western part of the Caribbean. And there's a pretty good front that's right in here too, a trough that would be possibly would shove it off toward the west, but if it's a little farther to the east, it could get pulled back out into the Atlantic, or it could go off toward the west. So you got a couple of different scenarios possible, but you can see that it's not real conclusive there when it comes to the Euro model. Canadian model also showing a very weak low pressure area over the southwestern part of the Caribbean Sea going through Halloween and the first few days there of November, but it generally keeps this a little bit closer to the Central American coast. Of course, if that happens and it drifts westward into Central America, it would dissipate fairly quickly, but it would be dumping some heavy tropical rains in mountainous areas there in Nicaragua as well as Honduras. And then finally, the Icon model, again, about the same as the other three, maybe a very weak low pressure area, but more of a gathering of moisture you can see there over the western part of the Caribbean. So the possibility is there, and I think as we go through time, these computer models are going to start to come into more agreement, and some of the extended models are showing something fairly decent developing there over the western part of the Caribbean. The wind shear in that area is relatively low right now, and it is forecast to stay relatively low. Fortunately, at least for right now, wind shear is going to stay pretty strong over much of the Gulf of Mexico. So if anything were to try to pull northward, let's say into the Gulf, at this point, it seems like it would be running into that wind shear and really wouldn't have much of a problem or much of a chance to get any stronger. But these wind shear values are going to be changing between now and the end of the month. But the water temperatures are definitely warm enough to sustain tropical activity all through the Caribbean Sea and generally most of the Gulf of Mexico. Coastlines are starting to see the waters cooling down, but if you get something that's in the Gulf of Mexico that's moving fairly quickly, easterly, and it let's say it gets into this part of the area and then tries to head northward toward the northern Gulf Coast, even though you've got some cooler waters there on the right along the coast, if you get something moving fairly quickly, there's a decent chance that it can hold its own, even though it would be moving over some considerably colder waters. So tropical cyclone heat potential is also quite high. But I want to move on to this global tropics hazard outlook. And this is brand new. It came down yesterday. So as of today, what we're looking at is a much higher chance for some tropical development between that October 30th and that November the 5th time frame. So this is up higher than what we looked at yesterday. Last week's had a much lower version of the possibility of some development there. So at least at this time around, it looks like it's a bit higher, and that is probably taking into consideration some of those computer models. So let's just for fun look at the computer model of the GSS, and this, or GFS rather, and this is from November 2nd through the 7th, and it's still processing right now. So this is the farthest that I've been able to get it to go on here. But as we look at it, it actually, now I'm looking at some extra frames, and I can go ahead and let's see if we can make a little bit of a change here, and I can give you the final frames for this particular model because it looks like it just now finished. So if you give me just a second here, you're going to see a little bit of a change, and you'll see the full extended version. So here is, there it goes. That's what it looks like now, drifting northward and then possibly into the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico and making a Florida landfall. Unfortunately, this particular model, that's very similar to what we saw with Hurricane Helene. And I will say, I'm going to go through a few other tropical systems that happened during the month of November where we did have a landfall on the western coast of Florida. So even though this is just one model and only one model run, most of the models have stayed over the Western Caribbean or pushed northeastward through Cuba and then back into the Atlantic Ocean. But there have been a handful over the last couple of days that have shot something into portions of the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So that is a possibility. Past tracks of storms during the month of November, going back to 1944, a lot of them do form in the western part of the Caribbean, and then they kind of shoot their way off to the northeast, but there have been a handful that have made their way into the Gulf of Mexico. So wanted to go through a couple of those. Hurricane Ada is probably the most recent November hurricane, and thanks, Jeff. I'm going to be glad to be on Planet Radio as well. I appreciate that comment there below. Hurricane Ada back in 2020, and of course Ada was, or 2020 rather, was that record-setting season. And Ada had a very strange path, first making landfall there over Nicaragua and then kind of pulling back out. It had several landfalls. It crossed over Cuba, then it made landfall there over the southern tip of Florida, then kind of whipped around, and then it moved off into the northeastern part of the Gulf of Mexico near Steinhatchee, Florida, which is basically where Helene and Debbie both made landfall earlier this year. Hurricane Ada there, that's a radar shot of it making landfall as it came across Cuba and then came back to the northwest across the southern tip of Florida. Another one, Hurricane Ida, not the Ida that we're familiar with here in Louisiana. This is 2009's version of Hurricane Ida. This was a hurricane that also kind of developed there over the far southwestern part of the Caribbean Sea. Most likely this was with that Central American gyre, rolled inland over eastern Nicaragua, crossed over the eastern part of Honduras, and then moved into the Yucatan Channel before lifting across the Gulf of Mexico. And it was a Category 1 hurricane with winds at 85 miles per hour just off of the southeastern coast of Louisiana. Now, we've never had a hurricane touch Louisiana during the month of November, but I would bet that Hurricane Ida's 2009 version was probably the closest, and then it made landfall as a tropical storm near Dauphin Island just about a day later, and that's kind of what it looked like as it was starting to fall apart. But you can see, at least on this particular satellite imagery, the center of circulation is right about in here. And you can see a lot of the convection is coming around on the outside of it. So the center of circulation there was when it was a hurricane, and then the center kind of came on shore of Alabama right there near Dauphin Island later on that week. Another one, Hurricane Lenny, and this is the most powerful hurricane that's on November record. And it had a nickname called Wrong Way Lenny because the start of this is there off the coast of Nicaragua and Honduras in the eastern part of the Caribbean Sea, and then it moved eastward and struck the areas of the Virgin Islands and the northern Windward Islands as a very strong major hurricane. Again, you look at this, most hurricanes would go in the opposite direction, coming from the Atlantic and working its way off toward the west. And that is an unusual path to go the opposite direction, but during the month of November, the winds shift considerably. So most of your tropical storms and hurricanes that develop in the Western Caribbean would kind of shoot toward the northeast and pull into the Atlantic Ocean. But this one pretty much went due east and affected a lot of our Caribbean islands there back in 1999. So it was kind of an unusual type of hurricane, but it was a very strong hurricane. Wrong Way Lenny back in 1999. Hurricane Mitch. Many of you probably would remember Hurricane Mitch because this was a major Category 5 hurricane toward the end of October, and it made landfall in Honduras, and then it stalled in Honduras for a number of days. Tremendous flooding there with Hurricane Mitch. Hurricane Mitch killed nearly 20,000 people there in Central America because of the remnant moisture that was still lingering there. But the remnants of Mitch eventually worked its way across Mexico, pulled into the Bay of Campeche, kind of grazed the Yucatan Peninsula, but reorganized as a hurricane that made landfall over southwestern portions of Florida. And then the final one, there's a look at Mitch there in the satellite as it was moving away from Central America, but the final one is Hurricane Kate back in 1985. And I will tell you that we had Hurricane Juan that made landfall in Vermilion Bay at the very, very end of October of 1985. And then Hurricane Kate made landfall in the Florida Panhandle on, let's see, that was November the 21st is when it made landfall. So this was an extremely late season system. And what's a little more unusual about this one is the initial development took place near Puerto Rico, kind of about where Hurricane Oscar did, but then this one drifted off to the west, curved into the Gulf of Mexico, and took what I would consider more of a traditional hurricane track. But based that this was in November, it's a little unusual to see something like this. So out of the 5 hurricanes that I just showed you, this is the only one that didn't originate in the western part of the Caribbean Sea. But Hurricane Kate making landfall on November the 21st as a category 2 hurricane there along the Florida Panhandle right around Mexico Beach. So it can happen. That's what Hurricane Kate looked like as it was passing just north of Cuba before it kind of went just south of Florida, but then curved its way into the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So you can get these late season storms. They're not that likely to happen, but they have happened, and that's why you never say never when it comes to November. Of course, Nadine and Oscar, I would call that kind of the October surprise, but let's hope that we're not looking at a November to remember when it comes to more tropical development farther down the road. So November, again, is still hurricane season. Most of us can kind of start to let our guard down a little bit here in the western side of the Gulf of Mexico, but the eastern side and much of the Caribbean still needs to keep watch for any tropical systems that might develop. Well, that's what I've got for you on this Wednesday. And if you like this video, please click the like button. It helps me out. Subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications too and tell your friends. And of course, starting on November the 4th, I'll be having my weather forecast on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. You'll hear me on the morning shows, midday, and the afternoon drive. And in between all of these broadcasts, make sure you follow my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll see you for Acadiana weather today, tomorrow morning at 7:30. And one last question there from Jeff. Let's see. Yeah, teaching more about the nerdy stuff. And you know what, Jeff? This is what I like about doing these on YouTube, is because all of the graphics, because, you know, now that I'm, you know, kind of a radio guy and a YouTube guy and I'm no longer in the TV guy, I have to utilize a lot of the free stuff that is out there. But Jeff, what's really cool about using all of these graphics is I put the links below in the description, and then that way you can go and still look at a lot of these different computer models and stuff like that, and you might even find something that you think's pretty cool too. But it's a good teaching way, and it's a good way for people to learn about the different computer models and the different products that are out there, and then you can kind of make your own weather forecasts and follow along as well. So I really appreciate both of those comments, Jeff, and I am looking forward to being on Planet Radio and the other two radio stations with Acadiana Broadcasting Group coming up in the early part of November. Well, I hope the rest of you have a great day. I will see you tomorrow morning at 7:30 for Acadiana Weather Today right here on YouTube. See you then.